Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The rise of online curated content, or OCC platforms, has revolutionized how audiences consume media. Nowadays, we have the freedom to choose what we want to watch, when we want to watch it, wherever and however. But this has presented both opportunities and challenges for content platforms, for distributors and also regulators alike. So recently, the Communications and Multimedia Content Forum of Malaysia released its self-regulation guidelines on online curated content. Joining us now to put into context what that means, not just for the industry, but for consumers, we have Mediha Mahmood, who is the CEO of the Malaysia Communication and Multimedia Content Forum. The Content Forum is an industry forum under the MCMC and its main role is to oversee and promote self-regulation of content over electronic networked mediums. Mediha, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. Just to start off our conversation, maybe you can very quickly encapsulate or describe what OCCs are and what prompted the Content Forum to introduce OCC guidelines at this particular juncture.
Thanks, Melissa. People are more in tune or more aware of the term OTT, right, over the top. But the reason why OCC was carved out of that is because when you talk about OTT, you're not just talking about things like Netflix and Disney and content streaming. You're talking about social media. WhatsApp is also an OTT. Instant messaging is OTT. So online curated content service providers are mainly those platforms which provide content over the internet, which are carefully curated and classified. It's essentially pull content, exactly the way you described it. You can watch it anywhere, anytime, anyhow you please. And it also has the added feature of personalized recommendations based on viewer preferences. And this is very different from linear TV, which follows a predetermined broadcast schedule. It's basically just push content. It's very different between that. So the reason why we had the OCC guidelines, or we had to do it, was because there is a significant difference between OCC and linear television services, particularly when it comes to content consumption processes and content regulation. And the reason why we came up with this was because when we had our content code revamp in 2021, there were significant calls from the public during our public consultation for there to be regulations on OCC content. But at the same time, we also need to recognize that OCC content being over the internet isn't exactly subject to licenses or legislation much. So everything we did was based on how we can collaborate with OCCs and work together in streamlining or aligning the content regulatory framework. So that's the motivation. And that's how we came up with a working group to craft the best solution in ensuring the progressive adoption of general standards within the industry.
Can you just elaborate very quickly why? So you alluded to earlier just the nature of OCC platforms, very different from linear television services. So why can't the same regulations apply for both mediums?
It would be misaligned because of the very fact, like I mentioned, how we consume content on OCC and linear differ. There are features in OCC that are not available on linear TV. For example, maybe I could give you, we can lock certain content which is rated at a certain level and not allow people under our care who are vulnerable, for example, children, from accessing it. You can't do that on linear TV. So these are among the differences between linear TV and OCC that we need to look at. So having the same regulations or the same guidelines for both would not help. In fact, it would be misaligned and might lead to an unlevel playing field. So we had to have a separate one for OCC.
Okay, and this is self-regulation. Why self-regulation? Why is self-regulation better than state regulation?
Okay, so self-regulation is actually supposed to complement state regulation, right? But in this case, there isn't state regulation on OCC or OTT at this stage. So we sort of took the first step in having self-regulation first. And we also, because when we had the public consultation, we did notice there were some preconceived ideas among members of the public who might have felt like just because OCC doesn't fall under legislation, then it's the wild, wild west and nobody's looking at it. But that's not exactly true, because we have to remember that OCC platforms are business. It's in their best interest to convey themselves as a safe, you know, platform for children as well. And so they already have guidelines that they follow. The only thing that we did was to make sure that all of these OCC players are in line with what those standards are and what are the best practices or the best content standards that should be followed, the industry standards as such.
Okay. So I have to ask you then, if this is kind of self-regulation guidelines for
Yeah.
the industry, we had a response in Parliament by the Home Minister Saifuddin Nasution recently, who said, well, the government is seeking or may soon seek to extend the remit of the Film Censorship Board, LPF, to include streaming services. Now, I understand that LPF right now, the jurisdiction is only for theatrical releases, but
Yep.
the idea is to curb what the Home Minister says is screening of content with LGBTQ messaging or communist messaging or Islamophobic messages. How do we think about that with all the challenges that you said of regulating OCC platforms? How would you see this in practice? Is it feasible?
Hope I don't get in trouble for this, but I don't think so. It is not feasible, especially at this day and age. And I have so much empathy for the censorship board. LPF, it is their job. It is their mandate to censor and to ban and to decide what content can be out there. But this was the mandate that was given to them ages ago. And we look at the content industry, the content ecosystem now, the influx of content is huge, it's humongous, and it's reaching people from all angles. It is absolutely unfair and unreasonable for us to expect LPF to shoulder more burden in censoring OCC content. I don't want to speak for them, but I do work closely with them, and I feel that it would add an additional burden. That's one thing. And I also think it's unfeasible given the fact that now we have content which users themselves have power to control. We have the power to censor, to ban these content from reaching us or children under our care. So it should be moving towards that rather than adding more content into the basket for LPF to deal with.
Okay, well, so maybe describe a little bit what has come up from that consultative process that has led to this inaugural OCC guidelines. What goes into it?
I think I'll just pick up from your question earlier. The concerns raised by the minister and members of the public has always been about harmful content. And whether you determine that harmful content by thematically like LGBT or superly violent content or content that's not suitable for Malaysian market, that's something that we've addressed in these guidelines. Because in the guidelines, if you have a look at it requires these service providers to exercise caution to ensure that whatever programs that they offer to Malaysians, targeted towards or accessed by Malaysians, is in accordance with the prevailing laws and regulations of Malaysia. So it also adds that we need to adhere to local laws, cultural sensitivities, consumer protection, it's all in there. And we've also included, and they've all agreed, that the content must not undermine, let's say, national interest, national security, public interest, public security, it's all there as well. So I feel like with these guidelines, the best practices, and an open dialogue with all these OCC providers, whether local or international, we're establishing a standard that we can all agree with. And they are also, we're sharing knowledge with them to understand what are the intricacies of Malaysian content ecosystem that they should be looking for.
Right. And how will you be monitoring compliance, Mediha? I mean, beyond just sort of encouraging OCC platforms to adopt these guidelines, will compliance be monitored?
We're a voluntary industry forum, so a lot of our work is voluntary. In fact, the OCC guidelines is voluntary. And I would have to also note here that these guys, for example, if I can name them, like Netflix or Disney or iQIYI or Astro or Media Prima, they were not at all compelled to work with us on this. They could have just ignored us totally. They had absolutely no reason to do it. And I can't speak for them, but I do believe that the reason they came together with us to establish is this because we have a common goal. We want to make sure that the platform is able to offer the content that they want to offer while not breaching laws, while not leading to harmful impact on children. So having said that, we do encourage widespread adoption among online content providers. And while the compliance with this OCC guidelines doesn't create legally enforceable responsibilities, it does constitute recommendations next, as the expressions of best practices. And additionally, we can and we do monitor compliance through ongoing dialogue, knowledge exchange. We do have them sometimes talking to us about, oh, we're gonna release a certain content next month that might be sensitive to Malaysians. What do you guys think about it? So that dialogue is still ongoing. Yeah.
Okay, so that's probably how it would impact the OCC platforms, but how do you see it impacting consumers? I mean, at the end of the day, the people who are watching the streaming platforms, how might the OCC guidelines affect what we get to view?
Well, we can take it two angles. There are two types of viewers. For example, let's take me. I'm pretty not conservative, but I'm not really keen in watching things which are 18. Whether it's sex or violence or gore, I just can't take it. So it helps me when OCC platforms such as these adhere to the guidelines, because the guidelines have clear descriptions of what these classifications mean. It goes up to 21. So for somebody like myself, if I don't want to watch it, if I see it's rated 18 or 21, I can just avoid it completely. But let's say, Melissa, you're a fan. You're a fan of something very gory and all these, horror movies. So the reason, what happens is, because there are people like me who don't want to watch it, doesn't mean that you are deprived of watching it. It's still being offered to you. So you get to watch what you want to watch, while I get to avoid what I don't want to watch. And it's really boiling down to user preferences and user empowerment, really.
Okay. You mentioned a bit earlier that kind of the regulation for terrestrial TV services does not work for, it's misaligned with OCC
Yes.
platforms. And one of the reasons is I'm sure because of online content being so dynamic, constantly evolving, making it quite challenging to create static regulation that remains relevant over time. How do you think about that when it comes to the Content Forum's regulations? Given the dynamic nature of content, how do you address all these kind of emerging trends and evolving technology over time?
That's exactly why the content forum is in existence, because we can come up with, let's say, a new content code or a code for OCC, or maybe later a code for social media, anything based on the needs of the current society or emerging trends. We don't have to go through the process of legislation, going to the first reading in parliament, getting to be tabled in parliament and passed. Now that's great for making laws, but when you're talking about things like the communications and multimedia industry, where you're talking about content, so many things are coming in very fast that we can't really predict. We just had our content code revamp in 2022, but at that time, generative AI wasn't a thing yet. So now it's a big thing, and people are already asking us, are you coming up with any regulations about advertisements who use AI? And we're like, oh, okay, we need to look into that, do the whole research and benchmarking thing again, and find out what is the global best practice, what are the risks and the challenges that are there. So the content forum it's good in that sense, because not only do we hear from the industry side, but we also hear it from the consumer side as well, and civil societies. There are risks that are coming in with all the emerging trends in content that we may not see. So this open dialogue and continuous need to improve the codes that we have or to create new ones is something that we feel is very dynamic for this business.
Right. So just in terms of where we are in advancements, do you look across borders? Do you look at other countries to see how they're doing it and whether we're kind of ahead of the curve or behind the curve? What's your sense, Mediha?
Absolutely. Everything we do, whether it's to come up with, like, for now, we're looking at the marketing of alcohol products. We're looking at influencer guidelines, greenwashing guidelines. We don't look at it from just our little point of view, because we even in Malaysia there are subject matter experts everywhere. But we really do need to look at the global perspective as well. We are very much connected with the regulators from other countries to make sure that we don't miss out on anything. If we're working on silos, or in Malay we call it shots diri, right? If we shots diri, we're going to miss things. And there are countries out there who are way advanced, who have dealt with these problems, who have done the research, probably have the technology, and we learn from them. So yes, definitely, we look at international benchmarking exercises as well.
Mediha, always a pleasure to talk to you. Mediha Mahmood from Content Forum there. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We will be back with more. Stay tuned. and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome back to Consider This. In light of the recent release of the Online Curated Content guidelines by the Communications and Multimedia Content Forum, the question is, how are major players in the streaming industry responding to this regulatory development? Let's ask Ruben Hattari, who is the Director of Public Policy for Southeast Asia for Netflix. Ruben, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. So why don't you share a little bit about Netflix's perspective on this? How do the OCC guidelines align with what the company's existing content policies and standards, and how it might change it going forward?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for having me on this channel, Melissa. So Netflix, we have been around for, not many people realize that we've been around for 30 odd years. We've always been in the business of entertainment, and our basically motto is and mission is to ensure that we can entertain the world. Now, in the past few years, as you can imagine, we have significantly continued investing more and more into local content. And Malaysia is not an exception towards that as well, right? So as you kind of go on our service, you will see more and more Malaysian titles to be kind of serviced on our platform as well. And the same goes throughout pretty much all around Southeast Asia as well. What I have been very impressed in Malaysia is largely with this concept around the content code, an online content code that has been driven by the content forum as well. And largely the reason why this is kind of critical as well, because in our effort to entertain the world, we need to ensure that in countries where we do operate, we acknowledge that there are certain rules and regulations that are in place and certain norms and values that are in place, that when we deliver our service, that we are delivering our service in a responsible way, in a responsible manner as well. And the content code actually lays out how platforms like ourselves that are operating in Malaysia should adhere to the local rules and regulations that would be applied.
Right. That's interesting, because given the global nature of OCC platforms and also just online content in general, how challenging would it be for a platform like Netflix to implement these types of guidelines across the different jurisdictions it plays in?
It is definitely difficult. This is why part of my job is having these kind of ongoing conversations with many kind of governments in the region. Ultimately, what governments want to know is that platforms, when they operate, is not only that they are there to entertain the citizens and the subscribers, but we do it in a responsible manner as well. And we do this, apart from, in Malaysia, where we agree to be part of this kind of content forum and this content code as well. We look at opportunities of how we safeguard our users. So, we have the pin controls, we have features on how to establish and to develop kids profiles as well on our platforms. And when you're consuming content, context is also key as well, right? So we do a significant great deal before you access a specific content, or before you click play. You should be kind of looking at the synopsis. You should be looking at the different guidances as well, to make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into as well. So we do all of these kind of add-on features and or what we call it add-on onto the applications as well, just to ensure that when people kind of use our service, they know what they're getting themselves into.
Okay. Talk to me a little bit about that collaboration with Content Forum. I understand it was a collaborative process. These are self-regulation guidelines and completely voluntary. So what was some of the key inputs that were important to Netflix that you wanted to champion, but also some of the maybe trade-offs that you had to think about? And how will you be measuring your own compliance with these self-regulations?
Yeah. So the world of entertainment has significantly changed in the past 20 to 30 years, right? So in the past, if you're consuming content largely from TV, the content that you would see would be pushed upon you as opposed to you, the consumers, is pulling. And the sets of rules of regulations that would apply to conventional or free-to-air TV is, I wouldn't say it's outdated, but it's completely different on how it should be applicable to services like ours as well. With services like us, in the online curated content, it is a very new space. I mean, we've only been operational in many parts in Southeast Asia only maybe 5 to 6 years ago. So there needs to be a new form of regulation that is established, right? We're not saying no to regulation, but we are trying to advocate for regulations that could be a win-win solution, not only for the industry, but also makes sense as well for our government while we are protecting the citizens and our subscribers as well. When I met Puan Mediha and as well as the content forum actually a year and a half ago, we thought that this concept was a concept that should be not only the pioneer in the region, but it should be replicated in many markets as well. And the rationale behind it is that this is a new way of trying to tackle issues where, normally regulators in the region, because the sheer amount of content that exists in online curated content, it would be impossible for any regulator to screen, to censor or to rate or classify all of the content that exists, right? So this concept of self-regulation allows the industry or allows the players that sign up all to be part of that kind of content forum or this kind of association to actually have certain measures in place to be the responsible player in the market as well. And just to ensure that the content that we deliver carries out and meet the standard norms that has been decided by the association or by the content forum. So, the content forum, when you look at the online content code, there are certain types of titles or certain genres of titles where we have agreed that we will not carry out this type of content, okay? So that is an area that we feel it's in our mission to entertain the world, we want to make sure that we are aligning ourselves. The other part I would say that is very useful, and I advocated very strongly for this as well, is just to make sure is that if governments want us to be held accountable, we want to make sure that we have all of the right measures in place on our services to make sure that our kids, my kids, when they watch the content, they are watching the right and age-appropriate content as well. So I'm specifically talking about the kids profiling, the parental pin controls, ensuring that certain kids profile can watch certain kind of age-gated content as well. So all of those measures in place, it's actually part of the content code. And my hope is that this content code could be replicated in other markets as well, and Malaysia being the pioneer of it.
That's very interesting. Are you saying that other markets don't quite have the same type of self-regulation for OCC platforms?
I think they're getting there. I think they're a lot more open now to actually have some of those conversations. I'm having conversations with the Philippines government, with the Indonesian government on this as well through the multiple channels. But the reality is that Malaysia is front and center, and I'm hoping that because of the success of Malaysia, other governments in the region will be much more open with this concept of a self-regulation model.
Ruben, thank you so much for speaking with me. Ruben Hattari from Netflix there, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.